The Honorable Gerry Connolly, first elected to the United States House of Representatives in 2008. A Democrat with an uncommon ability to reach across the aisle, Congressman Connolly was re-elected by his constituents 6 consecutive times and is now serving his 13th year as Congressman from Virginia's 10th Congressional District. Passionate about America's role in global affairs, Congressman Connolly is an experienced and senior member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. On matters that intersect management, mission, and technology, Congressman Connolly stands above and apart. He has no peer. Landmark IT acquisition and data management legislation he authored is shaping digital transformation and IT modernization efforts across American government. As chairman of the House Oversight and Reform Subcommittee on Government Operations, Connolly directs an oversight agenda that promotes efficient, accountable, and transparent government. Passion, intellect, leadership. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome one of America's most influential and respected technology legislators, the Honorable Gerry Connolly.
It's great to be with you, and we're emerging here in the United States and in large parts of Europe from an unprecedented pandemic. The last time the world faced anything like this was in 1917 and 1918, and it was arguably very dispositive at that time in terms of World War I. And that pandemic actually began, we believe, here in the United States. It began in training camps for World War I soldiers who were mustering for the first time in large numbers. And it began as a kind of innocent flu-like thing. But because we had so many vectors in so many young men in training camps in Kansas, it transmuted. And it went from being a mild, non-lethal flu-like virus to the world's most deadly virus up to that time, what became known as the Spanish influenza. And it killed tens of millions of people across the globe. And it directly affected the outcome of World War I in terms of infecting not only Allied troops brought to Europe by American soldiers, but it also affected German and their Allied troops in the trenches and materially affected the war. So, I mean, we now know pandemics are decisive events in human history. And I suppose, at least thinking from a Western perspective, there are some good stories among the bad. We know the bad. We know that 4 million people worldwide have died, 605,000 of them here in the United States. We know that some of those deaths were avoidable. We know that a lot of the infections could have been avoided with proper science and with protective measures. And we're still struggling with that. Vaccination resistance is a remarkable phenomenon that jeopardizes lives and threatens further transmutation of the virus, because the more vectors that virus has to infect, the more it can transmute into even more lethal forms. And we're seeing that as we speak. The new Delta variant is far more contagious and more deadly than the early outbreak of the virus itself. So there's much to be learned. From a technology point of view, I think we saw the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good, we adapted rather quickly. Everything was shut down. And somehow we managed to use technology to adapt, whether it was in the work setting, whether it was continuity of operations, whether it was feeding ourselves with restaurants, whether it was providing services or acquiring services. We saw all kinds of behavior change and adapt because technology allowed it. And if you step back and think about the magnitude of the pandemic, it is remarkable that business kind of continued. And we also saw the explosion, of course, necessarily, of telework. So for years of fighting to try to get telework as a permanent part of the workplace in both the public and private sectors, necessity finally broke that barrier down. So the cultural barrier that if I don't see you, you're not working, you're at home watching soap operas and playing with the dog, that went away because of necessity. We had to accept that people were going to work remotely, and by and large, they did and did successfully. And I think that was really a very important thing. We've also used technology, of course, the way we're doing it now. Hybrid meetings, Zoom meetings, webinar meetings. And we've learned that we don't always have to be physically together. And the long-term implications of that we don't know yet. Will it change the need for office space? Will it change and transform the commercial real estate sector? Will high-towered urban centers be at risk in terms of asset value because we no longer need all of that? We don't know yet. We do know that human beings are social animals. And we're seeing that as we reemerge here in the United States, and I suspect probably in Europe as well. We can't wait to see each other. People want contact. They want the social networking. They also want a hybrid. I mean, they also want to be able to continue to work remotely, but not 100%. And I think that's probably part human nature and part cultural change. So as we reemerge, there are going to be some changes in the workplace, especially in how we do business. And I certainly see that, in the political life as well. For the first time in the history of the United States Congress, we allowed hybrid hearings, hybrid voting, so that we have large-scale proxy voting during the pandemic. We'd never had that before in our history. If you weren't there, you couldn't vote. That's no longer the case, at least for the duration of the pandemic. We also saw the limitations of technology, and usually it was related to poor investments. And here in the United States, I'll give you a few examples. So back in April of 2020, we passed the first COVID relief bill. Huge bill, trillions of dollars to save the economy from going under. We were looking at unemployment rates that rivaled the Great Depression. We were looking at a GDP contraction that rivaled the Great Depression. We were extremely concerned about ever trying to recover from that if we allowed the depth to go where we thought it was going to go. And so on a bipartisan basis, for once we didn't fight about this, we all agreed overwhelmingly, Republicans and Democrats, we had to intervene. And we passed trillions of dollars of relief. And it was to shore up the public health sector. It was to shore up small businesses on Main Street. It was to help get checks into families' hands so that they could avoid eviction and keep food on the table. And it worked. We stemmed the economic slide. And remarkably, a year plus into the pandemic, if you look at GDP numbers, you look at unemployment numbers, we are recovering in a very rapid way. But for that intervention, that's not what we'd be talking about today. But we also saw the limitations of technology in trying to get that aid where it was needed rapidly. Into the hands of people who need it rapidly. So, for example, take the Small Business Administration. The goal was save mom and pop on Main Street. Well, the SBA has a fixed number of creditors it works with, banks, to manage its loan portfolio. And its loan portfolio has lots of conditions and requirements and documentation and certification requirements it puts on would-be borrowers. And its annual portfolio was $20 billion a year. In April of last year, we said, you know what? We're going to simplify who qualifies to broaden it. We're going to consider making a lot of those loans grants if the people meet simple conditions in keeping people on the payroll, so we're not adding to unemployment numbers. And we're going to go from $20 billion a year to $600 billion in 1 month. What happened to the IT system at SBA? Its IT system is known as eTrans, and it couldn't do it. It crashed. It couldn't handle volume. It couldn't handle reprogramming eligibility, simplified, streamlined eligibility. It couldn't handle broadening the financial institutions that were qualified to provide loans. And as a result, a lot of the targets, people we were trying to help, could not get the assistance they needed. And that was all because of IT. It wasn't because of lack of political will or lack of resources. It was because the mechanism for delivery, which is integral to the mission, which is what we have to get in our heads, certainly in the public sector, simply wasn't up to the job. IRS. IRS is a tax collection agency, but we made it a benefit delivery agency in the pandemic. And it helped save the economy. And it helped keep people in their homes. And it helped with food security, which became a big problem in the pandemic. I digress. But you're in one of the wealthiest states in the United States, here in Tower Club in Virginia. Before the pandemic, the total population of Virginians who were classified as food insecure was 9%. A year later, in the midst of the pandemic, that rose to almost 25%. 1 out of 4 Virginians were food insecure. That's a terrifying statistic. So making sure people had money in their pockets was good for the economy, but it was also good for families. But it had to be done quickly. Now, IRS has 60 different IT systems. It has IT systems that go back to the administration of Lyndon Johnson. Legacy systems, still using COBOL. Many of them, hard to maintain them because you can't find technicians who know how to do it anymore. If you had direct deposit, and roughly half the country did, IRS did a pretty good job of getting money into your account. But the other half of Americans who didn't have it, that was a different challenge with their IT systems. And instead of getting money out right away in April and May of last year, we were still delivering checks in October because the IT system could not keep up. In fact, they were limited to 5 million recipients a week for those not having direct deposit. At the state level, unemployment insurance, unemployment was just overwhelming us in terms of people filing for first-time claims because they had lost their jobs in the pandemic back in the spring of 2020. Now, at the federal level, we get to decide who qualifies, and we can augment benefits. But unemployment systems and the benefit level are determined at the state level. That means there are 50 different unemployment systems in America, and the federal government doesn't run it. So we, again, simplified eligibility, broadened it. So gig workers, sole proprietors, single workers were now eligible for unemployment. We added $600 a week to whatever the state benefit was, and we extended the benefits by 12 weeks. Again, an emergency, trying to stabilize the situation. And it worked, but the 50 states could not keep up with those changes in their IT systems. Many of the states had just very primitive IT systems. They had disinvested for years, and they couldn't keep up. And so the goals of the program were not being met. We are still struggling with it, by the way, today, in terms of state unemployment systems, because their IT system didn't keep up. So we've learned some lessons about how critical it is to invest in IT. But those lessons in Congress still need to be learned. President Biden, proposed $9 billion for the Technology Management Fund to help modernize IT in the federal government, and the Senate zeroed it out, saying it was tangential to COVID relief. Now, the stories I just gave you tell you otherwise. They're not tangential. So making sure we put a priority in IT is critical as we move forward, and I hope it's one of the key lessons we've learned, a takeaway from this pandemic. And I believe we can, if we learn those lessons, and this is one of the key ones, and we make those investments in public health, in IT, in our infrastructure, we're going to be stronger as we emerge from this pandemic, not only here in the United States, but our allies and friends around the world as well. Thank you so much for having me here today.